This conference will now be recorded.
For those who didn't attend last weekend, the retreats have been cancelled due to the COVID situation, and they have been replaced with online retreats that will take place in September, later in September. The first one starting on September 10 for 5 days. The second one on September 17 for 5 days. You'll find all the information on the meetup.com/Advaita website. Okay. If you have any questions now, go ahead. Okay, if there are no questions, you don't have to tell.
Francis, most spiritual paths situated within traditions provide a set of virtues that not only make the world a better place, but are efficacious for the path. For example, humility, which effaces the ego, and so forth. What are the direct path virtues?
They are the same. The only difference is that in the direct path, they flow naturally from the understanding of the universal nature of consciousness. On the progressive path, they are used as preparatory tools, if you will. In other words, the disciple is asked to provisionally abide by these rules up until his or her maturity, spiritual maturity, enables them to understand that which I've previously stated, that they in fact flow naturally from the understanding. If I can use a metaphor, a very young child is asked, for instance, not to cross the street without first making sure that he looks left and right, or just not to cross the street unless the light is green. And perhaps later on, he will understand why. It's the same here. The only difference is in the level of maturity. However, there is a big difference because in this case, in the case of the wisdom path, if you will, versus the religious path. In the case of the wisdom path, there is no coercion. There is no effort because it comes from the understanding, and therefore there is complete agreement with the rules. Whereas on the religious path, there is not a complete agreement. Sometimes that which the disciple is asked to do, or the way they are asked to behave, goes against their natural instinct, for instance. So they have to make an effort upon themselves to act in this way.
Thank you.
Francis, we all would agree that all there is awareness. But is it true, though, for awareness to shine or be aware of itself knowingly requires an absolute absence of the me in terms of belief or conditioning or energetic patterns, even though it may continuously go back and forth very quickly?
No, because everything is in the moment itself. Ignorance is not always present. Ignorance being the identification of awareness with an object, a prerequisite for ignorance is the presence of an object with which we can identify. In the absence of object, no identification is possible. Therefore, in the absence of objects, there is no ignorance. Now, in the presence of objects, there might be ignorance if there is such an identification. Ignorance can be, even in the presence of objects, temporarily, provisionally lifted. The metaphor is the following. The children are having a party while the parents are having a siesta. So as long as the parents are sleeping, well, they can drink the booze of daddy's booze. But if daddy wakes up, then they are in trouble. That's the situation of a temporary forgetting of ignorance, so to speak, although the root cause of it has not been eliminated. When the root cause has been eliminated, is tantamount in this metaphor, or the child having become an adult, and daddy and mommy are not in the house, and they can do whatever they please in their own house. The sage Xemaraja says, in the moment itself, one liberates oneself. In the moment itself, one binds oneself. Just as enlightenment appears wherever we want it to appear, ignorance appears wherever and whenever we want it to appear.
Can we say that there's a cause of root ignorance?
No, the only root cause for ignorance is the self. There is no other, there is nothing but God. Therefore, God is the only doer, just as God is the only perceiver. So there cannot be any other real cause than God. And that's what, that which I've just said is so interesting, because non-duality is really the place with both religions and materialism strangely meet. Because in materialism, there is only one cause, which is matter. In religion, there is only one cause, which is God. Whether you call it matter or God, ultimately is only a question of semantics. But just as the materialist is not a real materialist in most cases, because the materialist still believes in a separate individual, kind of somehow, strangely, having some form of independence from matter. In the same way, the religious person believes that there is an individual soul separate from God.
Thank you.
So I've been doing the experiment of, say I'm driving and I ask myself, okay, if there's only one universal consciousness, how would I behave? And usually it's of the form of letting people, in front of me in traffic, making more space for people, stuff like that. I don't have a sense of what it's supposed to teach me. I'm not sure what it's supposed to teach me when I ask that question.
Just the teaching gets revealed by the consequences of your change in behavior.
So, for example, is thinking there's on a separate consciousness, I drive along and maybe more aggressive, more angry, more scared. Whereas if I do it this way, I'm more relaxed, more peaceful, that kind of thing. I notice the difference. And that's it. I notice the difference in experience in that particular case. That's it. Okay.
More harmony, more when we conduct these experiments,
We've lost sound.
as a result, this personal expectation will kind of cancel the efficiency of the experiment. Remember that the precondition for the experiment is our not knowing whether awareness is personal or universal. As soon as we move from this position of not knowing to a position of ignorance in which we know that we believe that we know that awareness is personal, then we stop the experiment, right? Because the precondition that was necessary precondition for conducting this experiment is no longer met. So as a result, we pretend that we are conducting the experiment, but we are not. Therefore, it is important as we conduct the experiment not to have any preconceived idea of what the outcome should be like, should feel like, should. So we need to let the outcome surprise us. And without projecting an expected outcome. If we project an expected outcome, we cancel the experiment, okay? So we have to be open. Jean-Claude used to use the expression expecting without expecting. He meant expecting in openness without expecting anything specific.
Looking for an answer to the question without any preconceived notion of what the answer would be.
Yes. And the question is somehow an unformulated question. Because the question is not, will this or that happen? The question is, I wonder what's going to happen. That's a question.
So it's not even limiting it to an either or, it's to, I wonder what's going to happen.
I wonder what's going to
If
happen.
I look at it as consciousness is universal.
It's not, yeah. I wonder what's going to happen if I change my ways to ways that are now consistent with consciousness being universal. The best I can, to the best of my knowledge, to the best of my intelligence, to the best of my innocence. So it's an important point, a little tricky, not to cancel the experiment by saying, okay, for instance, if I behave nicely to people, towards people on the road, then I'm going to win at the lottery, or or I'm going to find the perfect relationship. Because then I would be, or I'm going to solve this specific problem that I have right now. No. I do it for the sake of doing it, and I don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, it felt like when I was doing it before, it was sort of a head game I was playing. And it didn't feel like I was doing it right. So thank you.
Yeah, when I choose ignorance, then I as consciousness, choose ignorance, then I suffer. Who suffers?
That's a good question. When we ask who suffers, or when we say I suffer, what do we mean? I understand what we mean if by I we mean the body. The body suffers. The body is in pain. Okay, I understand. If I eat the wrong kind of food, then the body suffers, right? If I do too much effort, then the body suffers. If I don't exercise enough, the body suffers. So we have to find the perfect balance. But that's not what we are talking about. We are talking about something else. If my relationship breaks up, I suffer. Who suffers? Only because I believe to be someone in a relationship. But who is in a relationship? What does it mean? Who is that person in a relationship? You know. So psychological suffering is directly related to the belief that there is somebody who suffers. Once we get rid of the belief that we are somebody, an entity which is localized somewhere dependent upon this body, psychological suffering disappears. Physical pain still appears because the body still can suffer. The body still experiences pain and pleasure.
So there is no suffering.
There is no psychological suffering. A precondition for psychological suffering is the belief to be a separate entity, something that we can never catch. It's related to the belief that consciousness is separate. That our reality is separate and limited.
So a sage never suffers. I mean, like psychological suffering.
Awareness, your awareness
Yes.
never suffers.
Yeah.
Don't think about the image you have of what a sage is, because that is not going to lead you anywhere. But ask yourself, does my awareness suffer? That which is aware of the suffering, does it suffer?
No. But can I just be ignorant sometimes? I mean, choose to be ignorant sometimes.
We have to ask the question, who is in ignorance?
Who is in ignorance? Who is?
When we are in ignorance, we believe that there is a limited entity, the same which we believe suffers, and the same entity who suffers, allegedly suffers, can be in ignorance or not in ignorance. But there is not such a separate entity which can be in ignorance or not in ignorance. If we try to find it, we don't find it. How do we know there is one? Because if we don't find the one who is allegedly in ignorance, nobody else can find it, right?
Yes.
On the other hand, we know that there is awareness. Awareness, we can find it because that's what we are. It's always present.
Thank you.
Thank you. When I say I suffer, or when I suffer, I resist against the flow of life. We could say that. Maybe I'm suffering of the fear of death, about the fear of death. So this is, I'm thinking I will die someday, and there is a certain unpleasant sensation in my body. So I say I suffer. Couldn't there be that tomorrow I have the same sensation in the body and I still know that I will die someday, but I don't resist that. So I say I don't suffer. So isn't saying I suffer or believing that I suffer also just a way of thinking?
Believing that I suffer is a way of thinking plus a decision to believe that I am a separate sufferer. You see, ignorance is not simply a way of thinking. It's not simply a concept. Because I can have the concept of separate entity without believing that I am a separate entity. So there is just as I can have the concept of communism or of Marxism without being a communist. So there is a very big distinction between the concept of a separate entity and the belief to be such a separate entity. So to move from the concept to the belief requires something else. That's why sometimes teachers on the advert lack clarity in that sense that they teach that ignorance is a concept. No, that's not correct. It's more than that. It's concept plus the attachment to a concept. And that's very important because if ignorance is just a concept, there is nothing we can do about it because we can understand that concepts come to us like the weather, right? And therefore, we have no control about it. So according to this view, we are doomed if the concept of a separate entity comes to us. But fortunately, that's not the case because ignorance is not just a concept. It is a concept plus our validation of this concept. And that's in this act of validating the concept, which transforms the concept into a belief. This act through which we validate the concept to transform it into a belief comes from our freedom. Therefore, the freedom is at the very beginning of ignorance. That's why I often say we choose ignorance. It's very important to understand that. Now, regarding the beginning of your question, all the forms of suffering eventually boil down to the single form of suffering you mentioned, the belief of awareness to be mortal, to be limited. And so when we try to liberate ourselves from this belief, we have become, I would say at that moment, welcome to philosophy, because we have really identified the root cause of misery. The root cause of misery is not to have enough money, not to be handsome enough, not to be young enough, not to be smart enough, not to be nice enough. That's not the root, not to be healthy enough. That's not the root cause of misery. The root cause of misery is to believe to be a separate entity, which is impermanent. Everything which is limited, separate, is impermanent. The belief, the fear of death is a belief to be a separate entity. That which is universal is permanent. That which is a fragment is impermanent. So, and it is at that moment that we enter the realm of philosophy, of true philosophy, of perennial philosophy, if you will, the common ground of all the forms of wisdom, you know, Taoism, Sufism, Advaita Vedanta, early Christianity, Gnosis, even Alchemia. So when we do this, we have really made a big step forward because we have identified a clear problem. The next step is to ask ourselves the question, is it true that I am a separate mortal entity? The body is mortal, obviously, but am I the body? Is consciousness my true reality? The reality of my human experience, which is consciousness, because it is that which is always present in my human experience. Is this reality of me dependent upon the body? What is the reality of me? What is the real me? Even if I assume that the real me is this body is not a reality unto itself. It's the reality of the body and the reality of the world are the same. They share the same reality, obviously. So the real me is universal, even from this vantage point. That liberates us from the root fear. That's the most important liberation. Although in the beginning, it doesn't seem to be that important because people will say, yes, but I still have the problem of physical pain. Yes, I still have the problem of money. Yes, I still have the problem of relationships, of not being good enough, not being beautiful enough, not being smart enough, not being nice enough, etc. I still have these problems. But because we have eliminated then the root cause of all these additional problems, they cannot maintain themselves. They lose their foundation. So the power of this realization, of this understanding, reveals itself over time as all these adventitious fears leave us incrementally, gradually.
Francis, a very similar question. It seems in terms of biological entities, whether virus, bacteria, animals, plants, anything, there's a prime directive to survive. Very different than a fear of death, but to survive at all costs. And that seems to exist across the board. Is that rooted in biology or awareness wanting to experience, or is it one and the same?
Well, it's both, because the biology is not independent from awareness, right? But yes, it's rooted in biology. That's the Darwinian, if you will, which is very valid. Scientific phenomenal explanation for it is that the reason we have this instinct of survival is that our ancestors who had this instinct have survived long enough to procreate, whereas the ones who didn't have this instinct have died on average earlier. So through natural selections, right, we are the biological heirs of those who had this instinct of survival, which manifests as fear, but it manifests as fear of real present imminent danger.
Yes.
it doesn't manifest as fear of death in an intellectual way. Because, for instance, animals, to protect their cubs, will expose their life, will fight to death fearlessly, right?
Right.
So, so the fear, an animal will fight fearlessly for its own survival, but also for the survival of the herd, or
Yes.
right?
Not fear-based, but this plant right here will fight for water and light,
Yeah,
but there's no fear,
yes.
as far as we know.
But what we call fear, there are two things. There are reactions in the body in the presence of clear and present danger. And these reactions in the body are there to enable us to escape, not to be detected, right? And to be ready for aggression or for getting the hell out of here, right? So it's a preparation. So adrenaline flows in the system. So the breathing gets more shallow, not to be detected by a predator or by a prey. Our presence to be more silent and not to emanate too much scent, right? All of this is a preparation. We become pale because the circulation goes deeper inside, so that if we can get wounded, there is going to be less bleeding, etc. All these reactions are natural in the body. So, but then we tend to find this as unpleasant. Whereas, in fact, if we are from the vantage point of consciousness, they are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. They are whatever it is in that moment. It is very strange, actually, that, for instance, the release of adrenaline in the body, which is one of the main aspects of fear, in most people, by most people, would be considered as suffering, right? As painful. But there is such a thing as addiction to that. So people who are in extreme sports or mountain climbers, or some people, crazy people in the military, right? Get addicted to the danger, right? And they seek the danger just to receive their dose or their fix of adrenaline, which shows that in and by itself, it's kind of neutral, since some people seem to enjoy it. Now, under ignorance, these natural genetically programmed reactions in the body get triggered in an almost chronic way. So we adopt a chronic position of protection, both intellectually and physically. People walk in a different way, just as we adopt sometimes a position of the victim, or the shoulders are up to protect the head, or to protect, or like that, to preserve the vital, the vulnerable part of the body in front. And then this attitude become chronic. We don't even realize we have them. And they are kind of in a twilight zone where they translate as a sense of doom, a sense that it's kind of lingering fear, a permanent fear. Now, the animal is not like that. The animal is afraid, take whatever steps are needed. The next moment, the predator is out of sight. Freedom.
Thank you.
Francis, so often one wants or tries to validate in one's own experience that which one knows only in concept. Is that very process invalid because it expects a result or at least a change?
I think if we are completely honest, we have to be open to the possibility that there is not going to be any change. So we have to be open to all possibilities, in which case there is complete openness. If we already expect a change, there is already some lack of openness there. We have to be very scientifically minded. In other words, we have to be open to the possibility that the hypothesis, which is the foundation for the experiment, is false. We have to be completely neutral. In other ways, for instance, another way to explain that, we, in our philosophical inquiry, we have to be open to the possibilities that God doesn't exist. And often people who come from an atheist view, in fact, when they convert, when they have a glimpse of their true nature, their spiritual evolution is much, much faster than the evolution of people who have come from the religious side. Because it came from this openness to all possibilities, whereas those who come from the religious side, there is often an element of belief, of conditioning, which is involved, which is very difficult to uproot. It is very difficult for a religious person to be open to the possibilities. There is no God. God is dead, whatever.
Similarly, when one reads the saints and sages of history, they often speak of an experience that for them ratifies what they knew. In my own experience, I do the experiments. I see that an orange is not an orange, it's just a collection of colors. Yes, true, but that doesn't really turn the wheels of my heart. What am I missing from this process?
Perhaps the wheels of your heart have been turned. From a different place, and you are kind of asking for your wheels to be turned again, and your heart is telling you no, but there is no point turning, which has already been turned.
Thank you.
Okay, so going back to the religious thing being a roadblock to unbiased.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
Often the religious path is a necessary step. Everything which has happened in our life was already part of the path. Everything was a necessary step, but go ahead.
So my parents, very religious people, in the sense that they believe strongly. And it hasn't really led to a lot of happiness at the end of the day. And it seems that I found something that has led to a lot of happiness, like fundamentally in the moment. And there's this sense of compassion that might turn into a little bit of a frustration, because to me it seems so simple, but I could see that they're suffering because they're attached to the conditionings that they've been told to believe. And my father, he's been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, so the chances of his survival aren't looking very good. And my mother is having a hard time dealing with that. So it seems to me that their religious search has started to hone in a little bit more towards something that's real, because the concept of death is not a distant thing for them anymore. So my question would be, is there any point in trying to help them view things from maybe a potentially more liberating way? Or should things just run their course?
Just give them love. Time is short. Act more. Follow your heart more than your concepts. Don't try to convert your father or your mother. Just be their loving song in this difficult circumstance. There is no need to convert your father. You need to support them, to support your mother. Don't avoid any contentious issue. Just love them. Go help them whatever is necessary. You're strong physically. Be an open presence, especially to your Father. You just be there without expecting anything. Just listen with all your mind and with all your body. Because it will teach you too. We're not here to preach. We are here to love.
In the case of my mother, she will, I agree with you. I don't want to preach, but she'll come to me and present something and ask me what I think about that. And I could have sort of a back and forth where, hey, like maybe this understanding of God isn't so different from mine. It's just that there's these concepts that are kind of mixed in with that. And I guess the best way to communicate my understanding is through the peace and through the love rather than
Absolutely.
an intellectual
Don't debate. There is no
Yeah,
point.
there's no point.
There is no point. And if we try to see what do all religions have in common, what is it that they agree upon? They agree upon that there is something bigger than the person, right?
Right.
Which they call God. And we also agree that there is something bigger than the person. So as a result, you can find this point of agreement. And even a materialist scientist also agrees that there is something bigger than the human being. So also with the materialist and the atheist, you can find the same actually, or very similar point of agreement. So it's important to, especially in your case, when you interact with your parents, that you ignore that which separates you and that you only agree on that which unites you. So you forget the rest. You don't try to make a point. You agree. Yes, there is God. If that's the way they express it, yes. Yes, you meet God after the death of the body, yes. It's perfect.
So you're saying I shouldn't try to drag them here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We don't, I don't send you all into the world to preach. The real preaching is what we do more than what we say, right?
Francis, I look around and I see things are different. Now, I don't think making that observation at the level of objects makes me a dualist. But I also notice that some are better than others. Some are more beautiful than others. Plato spent a lot of time on that one. Some people are better than others. Is that worth contemplating?
If you watch a theatrical play, some people are better than others, some people are smarter than others in the play. But there is only one playwright, right?
Got it. Thank you.
Any questions online?
Ron asks the following question. It seems that the original feeling of spaciousness from the glimpse is expanding to a feeling of encompassing everything. Is this real or imagined?
That's a good question that you have to ask yourself. Ask yourself, as an experience, what is space? What is time? What is consciousness or awareness? As an experience, are they different?
Another question by Lucas. Are there levels to consciousness one can embody?
Are there levels to
consciousness that one can embody? It seems there are some saints who have embodied awareness very well, but I might be hard pressed to say that they were at the level of awareness of Jesus. What is this scale of embodiment?
the awareness which has levels? It's not the awareness I talk about. The awareness I talk about is the reality which is hearing these words right now. So it's very difficult when you ask a question like this, which is based upon the implicit assumption that you and I, we use the word awareness with the same meaning, whereas in fact, not at all. So with my use of the word awareness being the reality, which is hearing these words right now, there are no levels. Because the reality which is hearing these words right now is not perceived phenomenally. And only phenomena have levels. For instance, sound can be more or less loud. A light can be more or less intense. The separation between two objects can be more or less wide. So to have levels, we need to have differences that are experienced. Do you experience any form of difference from one moment to another, for instance, in the reality that perceives? If yes, what is the nature of the experience through which you are ascertaining these differences? I understand that from one moment to the next, we can observe differences in that which is perceived in the phenomenal aspect of our experience. But in order to experience distinctions, differences in that which perceives, these would require awareness to have become a phenomenon, something perceived as an object, with limits, with borders, with colors, with sizes, with levels of intensity. So because my definition applies to consciousness and your definition of awareness applies solely to the content of awareness, in other words, to state of minds, I cannot answer your questions in a straightforward fashion. Now, if you're asking me, are there different levels on the phenomena perceived? Yes, no problem, of course. I agree with that. But the problem with this view is that it assumes that in each human being, there is a different entity. What is this entity? Which is different, which has different levels. Have you seen it, really? And most importantly, before you attribute such a separate entity to others, to other bodies, have you seen yours? The one you call I. Or when you say I, does it just refer to this reality which perceives and which, as a result, is devoid of levels? It's being devoid of levels opens up an extraordinary possibility which is that this entity, this reality that perceives, is the same for all of us. Not similar for each of us, not a different one, similar for each of us, like different people can wear the same brand of shoes and with the same model and the same size. No. We all share one single spiritual shoe.
Uchis, how do we know that we are truly welcoming whatever unpleasant thing we're welcoming without having a secret agenda to get rid of it?
This welcoming wouldn't be a real welcoming. Welcoming with an agenda, I agree with you. It's not real welcoming. It's welcoming with a desire to eliminate or to change. It's not real welcoming. In other words, welcoming is misunderstood on this path as an instruction of a change of attitude. Which is the result of an effort. You have to welcome everything, even if it is unpleasant. I mean, it's like when you tell the little child, go and kiss Aunt Melanie, who has a stinking mouth. The little child, he knows already, he is not very keen to do that. So this forced welcoming of something which is unpleasant is not real welcoming. And it is not the welcoming we are talking about here. It's not the welcoming of awareness. So let's first understand what is meant by the welcoming of awareness. It simply means that awareness never says no to anything that appears in it. Awareness just is, and everything just appears. So it could be understood that appearance of everything corresponds, if you will, to a yes from awareness. So awareness as such is a universal yes saying to all appearances, because a no from awareness means simply it doesn't appear. Therefore, whatever appears in awareness appears just and precisely because awareness wills it, creates it, perceives it. This appearance may include a dislike. In other words, when we are welcoming as awareness, this welcoming doesn't simply encompass the events in the world, or the events in the world and the events in the body. But it is a global welcoming, which encompasses the events in the world, the events in the body, but also the events in the mind, like the still small voice who tells you, it's not a good idea to do this. So this still small voice is telling us, don't do that. So the welcoming has to be a global welcoming. It is not type of fatalistic acceptance of whatever happens in the world and whatever happens in the body. It has to include also our intelligence, what our intelligence is telling us. And our intelligence may be telling us, fight this person, which is not welcoming, right? It's not welcoming of someone in the world. It's not welcoming of the events of the world, but on a different level. It's welcoming of the totality, because that includes our own. On the other hand, it may be that we get the first impulse to fight this person, but then in this welcoming of the totality, we realize that this desire to fight this person came from ignorance, came from the belief to be a separate entity. So this welcoming is much deeper and in this regard, very different from a fatalistic type of acceptance. It is based simply on this understanding that one of the aspects of reality as awareness is this universal welcoming of all appearances. So that when we try to implement this universal welcoming of appearances, unknowingly in the beginning, in this form of meditation, we take our stand as awareness, not as a separate entity. By taking our stand as awareness, as this universal yes thing, unknowingly in the beginning, we will get used to this position, so to speak. And we will realize how functional it is, how conducive to happiness and harmony it is. And eventually, hopefully, we will do our best to adopt it as our default condition. Well, thank you.